In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, 8 Navy SEALs lay bleeding in a rocky canyon, their radio crackling with static as enemy fighters closed in from all sides. Above them, the sky remained empty. No rescue helicopters, no air support, nothing. Command had issued a no-fly order due to severe weather conditions, effectively signing their death warrant. The wounded warriors had already been fighting for 18 hours straight, their ammunition running dangerously low, when they heard the unmistakable roar of jet engines cutting through the mountain air. But this wasn't supposed to happen. No aircraft were authorized to fly in these conditions. What they didn't know was that somewhere in the storm clouds above, a single A-10 Thunderbolt pilot had just made a decision that would either save their lives or end his military career forever. The morning of October 15, 2011 began like any other day at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan. Navy SEAL Team 6 operators were conducting their final equipment checks when the intelligence briefing arrived that would change everything. A high-value Taliban commander had been located in a remote village nestled deep within the Kunar Province mountains, an area so treacherous that local Afghan forces refused to operate there. The mission seemed straightforward on paper. Insert under cover of darkness, capture or eliminate the target, and extract before sunrise. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison led the 8-man team as they loaded into 2 Blackhawks at 0200 hours. The weather forecast showed deteriorating conditions, but nothing that would prevent the mission from proceeding. Morrison was a 15-year veteran who had completed over 200 combat missions, and his team trusted him implicitly. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, ran through final radio checks, while Senior Chief Petty Officer Mike Chen secured the team's medical supplies. These men had trained together for 3 years, becoming as close as brothers. The helicopters lifted off into a moonless night, their rotors beating a steady rhythm against the thin mountain air. As they flew deeper into Taliban territory, the pilots noticed the weather was worse than predicted. Storm clouds were rolling in faster than anticipated, and visibility was dropping rapidly. The lead pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Thompson, radioed back to base about the deteriorating conditions, but received clearance to continue. The mission was too important to abort based on weather alone. 47 minutes into the flight, the SEALs were inserted 3 kilometers from their target village. The Blackhawks disappeared into the darkness, leaving the team alone in hostile territory. Morrison immediately noticed something was wrong. The village appeared almost deserted, with only a few scattered lights visible through the swirling snow that had begun to fall. Intelligence had indicated this was a bustling Taliban stronghold, but the silence was deafening. Rodriguez established communications with base while the team moved into position. Through his night vision goggles, Morrison could see the compound where their target was supposedly located. The building appeared abandoned, with no signs of recent activity. Something felt off about the entire situation, but they had come too far to turn back without investigating. As the team approached the target building, Chen noticed disturbed earth near the compound's entrance. His experience told him these were recently laid improvised explosive devices. The Taliban had known they were coming. This wasn't a capture mission anymore. It was a trap. Morrison made the decision to abort, but as he reached for his radio to call for extraction, the night erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the surrounding hills as automatic weapons opened fire from multiple directions. The SEALs had walked into a carefully planned ambush. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in a horseshoe formation around the compound, with escape routes blocked by additional fighters. The intelligence had been compromised, possibly by a double agent within the Afghan forces who had provided the initial tip. The team immediately took cover behind a low stone wall as bullets whizzed overhead. Rodriguez frantically called for air support while Morrison assessed their tactical situation. They were outnumbered at least 4-1, with enemies firing from elevated positions that provided them with significant advantages. The nearest friendly forces were over an hour away by helicopter, assuming any aircraft could even reach them in the worsening weather. Within the first 10 minutes of the firefight, 2 team members had been wounded. Petty Officer First Class David Kim took shrapnel in his left shoulder, while Petty Officer Second Class Tony Martinez was hit in the leg by rifle fire. Chen worked to stabilize their injuries while the remaining team members returned fire, trying to keep the Taliban fighters at bay. The enemy seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition and fighters, with new muzzle flashes appearing every few minutes as reinforcements arrived. As dawn approached, the team's ammunition situation became critical. They had been in continuous combat for 6 hours, and their supplies were running dangerously low. The weather had deteriorated to the point where visibility was near zero, with heavy snow and winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour. Rodriguez repeatedly called for air support, but each request was denied due to the weather conditions. No aircraft could safely operate in these conditions, according to command. Morrison made the difficult decision to move the team to a more defensible position. They began a fighting withdrawal toward a rocky outcropping about 200 meters away, carrying their wounded comrades while maintaining suppressive fire. The Taliban fighters followed, seemingly unaffected by the brutal weather conditions that grounded all coalition aircraft. It became clear that the enemy was familiar with this terrain and had prepared for exactly this type of engagement. The rocky outcropping provided better cover, but it also meant they were now trapped. The position was defensible, but there was no way out except through the enemy forces that surrounded them. Rodriguez continued calling for help, his voice becoming increasingly desperate as their ammunition dwindled. Each casualty report he transmitted painted a grimmer picture of their situation. By hour 12 of the engagement, the team had been reduced to using captured Taliban weapons and ammunition. 2 more SEALs had been wounded, including Morrison himself, who took a round through his right thigh. The team's medic Chen was working with limited supplies to keep everyone combat effective. The Taliban fighters seemed content to wait them out, knowing that time was on their side. The storm had intensified throughout the day, with visibility dropping to less than 50 meters. Command continued to deny all requests for air support, citing the impossibility of flying in such conditions. The rules of engagement required clear weather and positive identification of friendly forces before any close air support could be authorized. These safety protocols, designed to prevent friendly fire incidents, were now preventing any rescue attempt. As afternoon turned to evening, the situation became desperate. The team was down to their last magazines of ammunition, and several wounded SEALs were showing signs of shock from blood loss. Rodriguez's radio calls became increasingly frantic as he reported their deteriorating condition. The Taliban fighters had begun probing their perimeter, testing for weak spots in their defensive position. It was during one of these probe attacks that Petty Officer Kim was hit again, this time in the abdomen. Chen worked frantically to stop the bleeding, but without proper medical facilities, Kim's chances were slim. The team was facing the very real possibility that they would all die in this remote Afghan valley, forgotten by history and abandoned by the very forces they had sworn to serve. Morrison gathered his remaining strength to call his team together. They were down to less than 30 rounds of ammunition total, and the enemy was preparing for what looked like a final assault. The snow continued to fall heavily, creating an almost surreal battlefield where visibility was measured in meters rather than kilometers. In his 15 years of military service, Morrison had never faced such a hopeless situation. Rodriguez made one final call for help, his voice barely audible over the radio static. The response from command was the same as it had been for the past 16 hours. No aircraft could fly in these conditions. The no-fly order remained in effect, and there was nothing anyone could do until the weather cleared. For the 8 SEALs trapped in the mountains, this meant they had been officially abandoned to their fate. 200 miles away at Bagram Airfield, Captain Lisa "Ghost" Patterson was sitting in the operations briefing room when Rodriguez's desperate transmission crackled through the speakers. The 34-year-old A-10 Thunderbolt pilot had been grounded for the past 8 hours due to the weather conditions that had trapped the SEAL team. She listened as the communications specialist read out the team's coordinates and status report, her hands clenching involuntarily as she heard the desperation in Rodriguez's voice. Patterson had been flying A-10s for 12 years, accumulating over 2,000 combat hours across 3 deployments. She was known throughout the squadron for her aggressive flying style and unwavering commitment to supporting ground troops. Her call sign "Ghost" came from her ability to appear seemingly out of nowhere to provide close air support when ground forces needed it most. But today, like every other pilot on base, she was grounded by weather conditions that command deemed too dangerous for flight operations. The briefing room fell silent as Rodriguez's transmission ended. Major Richard Stevens, the squadron commander, shook his head grimly as he looked at the weather reports. Visibility at the SEAL team's location was essentially zero, with cloud ceilings down to 200 feet and winds gusting over 70 miles per hour. No responsible commander would authorize flight operations in such conditions, especially for a close air support mission that required precise navigation and target identification. Patterson studied the tactical display showing the SEAL team's position. She had flown missions in that area before and knew the terrain intimately. The rocky canyon where the team was trapped was surrounded by peaks that rose over 8,000 feet, creating a natural bowl that would amplify the effects of the storm. Flying in those conditions would be incredibly dangerous, with mountains hidden by clouds and winds that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. As the briefing continued, more transmissions came through from Rodriguez. The team's ammunition was critically low, and they had multiple casualties who needed immediate medical attention. Kim's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Chen was running out of medical supplies. The Taliban forces surrounding them had grown throughout the day as word of the trapped Americans spread through the local fighter networks. Patterson's mind raced as she considered the tactical situation. The A-10 Thunderbolt was specifically designed for close air support missions, built to operate in adverse conditions and provide precise firepower in support of ground troops. Its twin engines and armored cockpit made it one of the most survivable aircraft in the Air Force inventory. More importantly, she knew those mountains better than almost any other pilot in theater. During the break in the briefing, Patterson approached Major Stevens privately. She explained that she believed she could reach the SEAL team's position by flying through the valleys rather than over the peaks, using terrain-following techniques to stay below the worst of the weather. Stevens immediately rejected the idea, pointing out that such a flight would violate standing orders and could result in court-martial proceedings if anything went wrong. The argument continued for several minutes, with Patterson becoming increasingly insistent that something had to be done. She had lost friends on previous missions when air support couldn't reach them in time, and she wasn't willing to let that happen again. Stevens understood her frustration but maintained that the risk was too great. The weather conditions made the mission essentially suicidal, and he couldn't authorize any pilot to attempt it. Patterson returned to her quarters, but she couldn't stop thinking about the trapped SEALs. She reviewed the weather reports and flight paths, convinced that there was a way to reach them. The storm was moving from west to east, which meant that by flying a southern approach and staying low, she might be able to avoid the worst conditions. It would require flying through terrain that was barely mapped, but it was theoretically possible. As evening approached, Rodriguez's transmissions became increasingly desperate. The team was down to their last few rounds of ammunition, and Kim was losing consciousness from blood loss. The Taliban fighters were preparing for a final assault that would likely overrun the SEAL position within the hour. Patterson made a decision that would either save 8 lives or end her military career. She quietly made her way to the flight line where her A-10 was parked. The aircraft had been pre-flighted earlier in the day, before the weather conditions deteriorated, and all systems were operational. The ground crew had secured the aircraft for the storm, but the tie-downs could be removed quickly. Patterson began her pre-flight inspection by flashlight, checking every system twice to ensure the aircraft was ready for what would be the most dangerous mission of her career. The A-10's weapons load was standard for close air support operations. The 30mm GAU, 8 cannon with 1,174 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition, 2 AGM, 6.5 Maverick missiles and 4 500-pound laser-guided bombs. She also carried 2.75-inch rockets and had full defensive countermeasures, including chaff and flares. It was enough firepower to devastate the Taliban forces surrounding the SEAL team, if she could reach them. Patterson's hands shook slightly as she started the engines. She knew that taking off without authorization was a violation of multiple military regulations and would likely result in her court-martial. But she also knew that 8 American warriors were about to die if someone didn't act. The sound of the twin General Electric TF-34 engine spooling up was quickly swallowed by the howling wind that rocked the aircraft even on the ground. Tower control immediately hailed her as she began taxiing toward the runway. Patterson ignored the radio calls, knowing that acknowledging them would only result in orders to return to parking. She could see vehicles racing toward the runway, but she was already committed to her course of action. The A-10 accelerated down the runway through horizontal sheets of snow and rain, its heavy airframe fighting against crosswinds that pushed it toward the runway edges. The takeoff was harrowing, with visibility dropping to near zero as soon as the aircraft left the ground. Patterson climbed quickly to get above the worst of the surface turbulence, but she had to level off at 500 feet to stay below the cloud ceiling. Flying by instruments alone, she turned toward the mountains where the SEAL team was trapped, knowing that she was now officially a rogue pilot who had violated direct orders. Navigation in the storm was incredibly challenging. GPS was intermittent due to the weather conditions, and traditional navigation aids were useless in the mountainous terrain. Patterson relied on her intimate knowledge of the area, flying from memory as she threaded her way through valleys that were invisible in the darkness. The aircraft was buffeted constantly by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. 30 minutes into the flight, Patterson established radio contact with Rodriguez. The surprise in his voice was evident as she identified herself and requested target information. The SEAL team had given up hope of rescue, and hearing an American pilot's voice brought tears to Morrison's eyes. Patterson could hear gunfire in the background as Rodriguez transmitted the team's exact coordinates and the locations of enemy positions. The tactical situation was complex. Taliban fighters were positioned in a rough circle around the rocky outcropping where the SEALs had taken cover. There were at least 30 enemy positions scattered across the surrounding hills, With some fighters as close as 50 meters to the American forces, any airstrike would have to be incredibly precise to avoid hitting the SEALs while neutralizing the threats around them. Patterson began her approach run through the valley, flying at 200 feet above ground level in near-zero visibility. She was essentially flying blind, using only her instruments and Rodriguez's radio guidance to navigate toward the target area. The mountainous terrain created severe turbulence that threatened to throw the aircraft into the ground at any moment. She had to make constant control inputs just to keep the A-10 stable enough for an attack run. As she approached the target area, Patterson could see muzzle flashes through the snow and rain. The firefight was still ongoing, with the Taliban forces maintaining pressure on the SEAL position. She made visual contact with Rodriguez, who was using an infrared strobe that was visible through her night vision system. The strobe helped her identify the friendly position, but the enemy forces remained largely invisible in the storm. Patterson's first attack run targeted a group of Taliban fighters who had been advancing on the SEAL position from the north. She lined up the shot using her targeting pod and fired a burst from the 30mm cannon. The explosive rounds tore through the rocky terrain where the enemy fighters were positioned, sending up geysers of stone and dirt that were visible even through the storm. The advance was stopped, but there were still dozens of enemy fighters in the area. The roar of the A-10's cannon echoed through the valley like thunder, and for the first time in 18 hours, the constant gunfire directed at the SEAL team began to slacken. Rodriguez could barely believe what he was hearing and seeing. Through the swirling snow, he watched tracer rounds from the aircraft's 30mm cannon tear into Taliban positions that had been harassing them all day. The psychological impact was immediate. Enemy fighters who had been confident in their numerical superiority suddenly found themselves under attack from an aircraft that shouldn't have existed. Patterson banked sharply to the left, using the valley walls to mask her approach for a second attack run. The Taliban fighters were now aware of her presence and began directing small arms fire skyward, though their chances of hitting a fast-moving aircraft in these weather conditions were minimal. She could see muzzle flashes scattered across the hillsides as enemy fighters tried to track her movement through the storm. Morrison used the lull in enemy fire to reorganize his team's defensive positions. Kim was barely conscious but still breathing, and Chen had managed to stabilize the other wounded SEALs enough to keep them in the fight. The sudden appearance of air support had given the team new hope, but they all knew that their situation remained desperate. They were still outnumbered and low on ammunition, even with Patterson providing cover from above. The second attack run came from the east, with Patterson diving through the clouds to strafe a group of Taliban fighters who had been firing from behind a cluster of boulders. The 30mm rounds shattered the rocks and sent the surviving fighters scrambling for new cover. Each pass was incredibly dangerous, requiring Patterson to fly below the surrounding mountain peaks while maintaining enough speed and maneuverability to avoid ground fire. Radio communications between Patterson and Rodriguez became the lifeline that coordinated the defense of the SEAL position. Rodriguez called out target locations while Patterson searched for enemy positions through her targeting systems. The storm made visual identification nearly impossible, forcing her to rely on brief glimpses of muzzle flashes and Rodriguez's precise descriptions of enemy locations relative to the SEAL position. The Taliban forces began to adapt to the presence of the A-10, spreading out and using the terrain to make themselves harder targets. Patterson realized that cannon runs alone wouldn't be enough to break the siege. She needed to use her precision-guided munitions to eliminate the enemy fighting positions that were too close to the SEAL team for cannon fire. The problem was that dropping bombs in these weather conditions required exceptional precision to avoid hitting friendly forces. Patterson selected one of her 500-pound laser-guided bombs and began the complicated process of acquiring targets through her targeting pod. The storm interference made it difficult to maintain a laser lock on target, but she managed to identify a Taliban mortar position that had been harassing the SEALs throughout the day. The mortar crew had set up behind a ridgeline about 300 meters from the SEAL position, thinking they were safe from direct fire. The bomb release required Patterson to maintain straight and level flight for several crucial seconds, while the weapons guidance system locked onto the target. This made her aircraft vulnerable to ground fire, but she held her course until the weapon was away. The 500-pound bomb struck the mortar position with devastating accuracy, eliminating the crew and destroying their equipment in a massive explosion that lit up the valley despite the storm. The destruction of the mortar position marked a turning point in the battle. Taliban fighters who had been confident in their ability to overwhelm the trapped Americans began to reconsider their tactics. The sudden appearance of precision airstrikes had shifted the balance of power, and enemy commanders started pulling their forces back to more defensible positions further from the SEAL team. Patterson's fuel situation was becoming critical. The A-10 carried enough fuel for approximately 2 hours of flight time, and she had already been airborne for over an hour. The constant maneuvering required to avoid the mountains and deliver accurate fire was consuming fuel faster than normal. She needed to make every remaining attack run count if she was going to give the SEALs enough breathing room to organize their evacuation. The third precision strike targeted a Taliban command post that had been identified through radio intercepts. Intelligence analysts at Bagram had been monitoring enemy communications and determined that a senior Taliban commander was directing the attack from a position approximately 500 meters south of the SEAL team. Patterson approached the target area at low altitude, using a ridgeline to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The AGM-65 Maverick missile locked onto the target building and streaked through the storm with deadly accuracy. The explosion destroyed the command post and eliminated several key Taliban leaders, disrupting their ability to coordinate the continuing attack. The loss of their commanders created confusion among the remaining fighters, with some groups beginning to withdraw from their positions around the SEAL team. Meanwhile, Rodriguez was coordinating with extraction forces that were preparing to launch despite the continuing bad weather. The presence of Patterson's A-10 had convinced commanders that rescue operations were possible, even in the deteriorating conditions. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were being prepared for immediate launch, with pilots who volunteered for the dangerous mission despite the weather restrictions. Patterson's fourth attack run eliminated a machine gun nest that had been pinning down the eastern side of the SEAL perimeter. The 30mm cannon fire was so accurate that it destroyed the weapon without causing casualties among Taliban fighters who immediately surrendered after witnessing the precision of the airstrikes. Word was spreading among enemy forces that continuing to fight was essentially suicidal given the presence of close air support. As Patterson prepared for what might be her final attack run, Rodriguez reported that the Taliban forces were beginning a general withdrawal from the area. The combination of precision airstrikes and the psychological impact of the A-10's presence had broken their will to continue the siege. Scattered groups of fighters remained in the area, but the coordinated attack that had trapped the SEALs for 18 hours was falling apart. The extraction helicopters arrived just as Patterson's fuel reached critical levels. She had enough remaining for one more pass over the area before she would be forced to return to base. Rodriguez guided the Black Hawks to a landing zone about 200 meters from the SEAL position, an area that Patterson had cleared with her earlier strikes. The helicopter pilots executed a textbook combat landing despite visibility that was still near zero. The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with Chen and the other medics quickly loading the wounded SEALs aboard the first helicopter, while Morrison's team provided security. Kim was unconscious but stable, and the other wounded warriors were conscious and talking. The second helicopter provided cover while the evacuation was completed, with Patterson making one final strafing run to discourage any Taliban fighters who might be considering an attack on the landing zone. As the Black Hawks lifted off with the rescued SEAL team, Patterson turned her aircraft toward Bagram Airfield. Her fuel gauge showed less than 10 minutes of flying time remaining, barely enough to reach base safely. The flight back through the storm was even more challenging than the outbound trip, with Patterson fighting severe turbulence and icing conditions that threatened to bring down the aircraft. The landing at Bagram was accomplished with emergency vehicles standing by as Patterson's fuel ran out just as she touched down. The A-10 rolled to a stop with vapors coming from its fuel vents, having literally flown on fumes for the final minutes of the mission. Ground crews immediately surrounded the aircraft as Patterson shut down the engines, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Major Stevens was waiting for Patterson as she climbed out of the cockpit. His expression was unreadable as he approached the pilot who had directly violated his orders and risked court-martial to save 8 American lives. The expected confrontation never materialized, however, as Stevens simply nodded and told Patterson to report for debriefing in the morning. Word of the successful rescue had already reached higher headquarters, and the focus had shifted from disciplinary action to understanding how the mission had been accomplished. The SEAL team was evacuated to the medical facilities at Kandahar Airfield, where Kim underwent emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding from his abdominal wound. All 8 SEALs survived their ordeal, though several required extended medical treatment for their injuries. Morrison later credited Patterson's intervention with saving not just their lives, but preventing a propaganda victory for Taliban forces who had been planning to capture American prisoners. The official after-action reports credited the successful rescue to innovative tactical procedures and exceptional pilot skill, carefully avoiding any mention of violated orders or unauthorized flight operations. Patterson received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, though the citation was worded vaguely to avoid drawing attention to the circumstances surrounding the mission. The no-fly order remained in effect for another 6 hours after the rescue, highlighting just how dangerous the conditions had been. Rodriguez later said that hearing Patterson's voice on the radio was the moment he knew they were going to survive. The 8 SEALs had prepared themselves for death in that remote Afghan valley, abandoned by the system that had sent them there. Patterson's decision to break the no-fly order and risk everything for fellow Americans embodied the warrior ethos that defines Special Operations Forces. Leave no one behind, regardless of the personal cost. The story of the rescue became legendary within Special Operations communities, though it was never widely publicized due to the sensitive nature of the mission and the questions it raised about command decisions during crisis situations. Patterson continued flying combat missions in Afghanistan until her deployment ended 3 months later, never speaking publicly about the night she became a ghost in the storm to save 8 American lives. Years later, when asked about her decision to violate orders and risk court-martial, Patterson's response was characteristically direct. Those were Americans down there, and they needed help. Everything else was just paperwork. The bond forged between the A-10 pilot and the SEAL team that night endures to this day. A reminder that sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules, and that heroes are defined not by the orders they follow, but by the courage they show when following orders means letting good people die.